Imagine waking up in a world where the United States never truly existed as one nation. Instead of 50 United States, there are two rival countries sitting side by side, forever locked in a tense coexistence. On one side, the Union, industrial, fast-moving, and increasingly modern. On the other, the Confederate States of America, built on a social order that proudly declared slavery as its cornerstone. It sounds like a work of alternate history fiction, but here's the twist. The Confederate leadership had an actual blueprint for this world. They weren't improvising. They wrote down their plans, they gave speeches, they drafted a constitution, and they even dreamed of expanding far beyond the American South. So tonight, we're not just asking the usual, what if the South had won the Civil War? We're asking something sharper. What did the Confederates really plan to do if they had succeeded? To answer that, let's go straight to the documents. In March 1861, just weeks before the war erupted at Fort Sumter, Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens delivered a speech in Savannah, Georgia. It would go down in history as the infamous Cornerstone Speech. In that speech, Stephens declared plainly that the new nation was founded on the idea that, in his words, the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and normal condition. He went further, boasting that the Confederate government was the first in the world built upon this great truth. That wasn't speculation. That was the second highest official in the Confederacy stating publicly what the dream of this new nation was. And this wasn't just rhetoric. The Confederate Constitution, adopted in March 1861, made slavery permanent. Unlike the U.S. Constitution, which carefully avoided the word slavery in its original text, the Confederate version used the word directly and repeatedly. It explicitly protected the right to own slaves, forbade any law that would impair that right, and even prevented individual states from abolishing slavery within their borders. In other words, the Confederacy wasn't just fighting to preserve slavery in 1861. It was trying to guarantee that slavery would exist forever. If they had won, this would have been the unshakable foundation of their society. But the Confederate dream didn't stop at keeping slavery alive within its existing borders. Many Southern leaders openly spoke of expansion. Cuba was a particular obsession. Southern politicians had long eyed the island as a potential new slaveholding state. And Jefferson Davis himself believed that the Confederacy could spread slavery into the Caribbean and perhaps even Central and South America. There was serious talk of acquiring territory in Mexico and Nicaragua, creating a belt of slaveholding states stretching beyond the American South. In their vision, the Confederacy wasn't just a breakaway republic. It was the nucleus of a slave empire across the Western Hemisphere. Now, let's pause and consider what that would have meant. If the South had won and established independence, their economy would have been almost entirely based on cotton, tobacco, and slavery. In fact, they called cotton King Cotton, believing it was so essential to Britain and France that those great powers would have no choice but to recognize the Confederacy diplomatically. Confederate diplomats in London and Paris argued that Europe couldn't afford to lose access to Southern cotton, and the South believed this leverage would not only win them independence, but would allow them to expand their system abroad with European tolerance or even support. In reality, Britain and France hesitated. Both nations had abolished slavery decades earlier, and there was deep anti-slavery sentiment among their populations. But if the Confederacy had managed to win militarily, they would have used cotton as their trump card to demand recognition. Some Confederate leaders even dreamed of forging alliances with European powers, hoping to balance against the Union and ensure their survival as a global player. So let's put the pieces together. Document after document shows that the Confederates had a plan for a society with slavery as a permanent constitutional institution. They imagined themselves not as a fragile breakaway, but as the first stage of a larger expansionist empire. And they sought to harness global trade and European diplomacy to make it happen. This was not the lost cause myth we often hear about later, where the war is portrayed as a noble struggle for vague states' rights. This was specific, written, and blunt. Preserve slavery forever, expand it geographically, and build a nation defined by racial hierarchy. Now, let's step into the what if. Suppose the Confederacy had actually pulled it off. Perhaps they won a decisive victory at Gettysburg. Perhaps Britain or France recognized their independence. Perhaps Lincoln lost political support and the Union negotiated peace. What then? First, America would not be America as we know it. There would be two rival countries, the United States of America and the Confederate States of America, staring at each other across a hostile border. Imagine an America permanently divided, like a North Korea and South Korea situation, only with slavery embedded in the very identity of one side. The Confederacy would have locked slavery into its constitution, meaning even if individual states wanted to reform, they couldn't. The entire system was frozen, and that raises chilling questions. Would slavery still exist today in some form? It's hard to imagine it lasting into the 21st century, but in the 19th and even early 20th centuries, it might have persisted for decades longer. Enslaved people in the South wouldn't have had the Emancipation Proclamation or the 13th Amendment to free them. The abolitionist movement would have remained confined to the North, while the Confederacy silenced it ruthlessly in the South. The civil rights struggles we think of in the 20th century might never have happened because the very premise of equality would have been denied at the constitutional level. Next, consider foreign policy. If the Confederacy had survived, it likely would have tried to expand southward. We know this because Confederate leaders said it openly. Annexing Cuba was a long-standing Southern dream. Control of the Caribbean would have made the Confederacy a serious naval power, especially with European trade flowing through its ports. And if they had reached into Mexico or Central America, they would have turned the Gulf of Mexico into a Confederate lake, dominating commerce in the Western Hemisphere. Economically, though, the Confederacy faced limits. Their system resisted industrialization. Many leaders actually believed industry was corrupting and that an agricultural society based on plantations was more pure. In their dream, they weren't trying to rival northern factories or northern railroads. They imagined a slower, more aristocratic civilization, almost medieval in its hierarchy. That might have given them short-term pride, but in the long run, it would have made them vulnerable. A Confederate nation stuck in the 19th century economy might not have kept up with the industrial revolutions of the 20th. And then there's the moral vision. Stevens's cornerstone speech wasn't just words, it was the essence of their ideology. The Confederacy envisioned itself as the first modern nation explicitly built on white supremacy. In their mind, democracy and liberty were only for white men. That idea, written into law and celebrated as a great truth, would have shaped their entire culture. Imagine textbooks, churches, political speeches, and national holidays all reinforcing the belief that slavery was divinely ordained and scientifically justified. That's the world the Confederates wanted to create. Of course, we know they lost. The Union prevailed, slavery was abolished, and the United States remained one nation. But even in defeat, the Confederacy's dream didn't vanish overnight. For generations, the ideology of white supremacy and the myth of the lost cause shaped Southern memory. Statues were erected, textbooks downplayed slavery, and the dream of the Confederacy lived on in distorted form. That's why it's so important to go back to the actual documents, to remind ourselves what they really wanted, not the sanitized version that came later. So, what if the South had won? Based on their own constitution, speeches, and plans, the Confederacy would have been a nation dedicated to slavery, dreaming of expansion, and clinging to an outdated vision of aristocracy. It would have reshaped the Americas, perhaps slowed global progress toward human rights, and created a fractured, dangerous world. Thankfully, we don't live in that alternate history. But by studying their documented plans, we gain a clearer understanding of what was at stake in the Civil War, and why the Union's victory was not just political, but moral and global in its consequences. And now, here's the question for you. When you hear people talk about heritage or states' rights as the cause of the war, do you think they really understand these documents? Do you think most people realize that the Confederacy wrote slavery into its Constitution, that its vice president bragged about white supremacy as the foundation of the nation, that its leaders dreamed of a slave empire stretching across the hemisphere? Or do you think the memory has been rewritten, softened, and distorted? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to hear what you think about the Confederate Dream and what the world might have looked like if it had come true. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into history, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more thought-provoking history videos, and share this with someone who still wonders about the Civil War's what-ifs.